The cigarette economy, hyperinflation, and black markets. In 1945, Part 1, The Collapse of Money. In the spring of 1945, across the devastated landscape of Europe, the fundamental basis of civilization had crumbled. Cities lay in ruins, their buildings reduced to hollow shells and mountains of rubble. Millions wandered as displaced persons, severed from homes, families, and nations. But perhaps nothing symbolized the totality of the collapse more completely than the death of money itself. The German Reichsmark, which had once represented the economic might of Central Europe's greatest industrial power, had become a cruel joke. In Berlin, workers received their wages in wheelbarrows, not because they were paid so handsomely, but because the physical volume of banknotes required to purchase even basic necessities had become absurd. A single loaf of bread, if one could be found, might cost 5 million marks 1 week, 10 million the next. The numbers had lost all meaning. People watched their life savings evaporate, not through theft or confiscation, but through the simple mathematical reality that their currency had ceased to function as a store of value. In Vienna, desperate residents discovered an alternative use for the colorful paper that had once been money. Reichsmarks burned longer than newspaper, and fuel was scarce. The symbolic act of using currency as kindling perfectly captured the moment. Money had become more valuable as a source of heat than as a medium of exchange. The psychological impact was devastating. For generations, people had worked, saved, and planned their futures based on the assumption that money would hold its value. That assumption had been obliterated. The hyperinflation was not uniform across Europe. The French franc struggled but survived. The British pound remained relatively stable, backed by an empire still intact, if strained. But in Germany, Austria, and much of Eastern Europe, the traditional mechanisms of commerce had simply ceased to function. Shopkeepers refused to accept payment in official currency. Workers refused wages that would be worthless before they could spend them. The entire edifice of the monetary economy had collapsed. Into this vacuum emerged something unexpected, something that would fascinate economists for decades to come. In the displaced persons camps scattered across Germany, in the prisoner of war camps, in the ruins of great cities, in the improvised marketplaces that sprang up wherever people gathered, a new currency established itself without government decree, without legal framework, without institutional backing of any kind. It emerged purely through the voluntary choices of millions of desperate people, all independently arriving at the same conclusion about what held value. The new currency came in small white cylinders, wrapped in paper, packaged 20 to a cardboard box. Cigarettes became the universal standard of value in a continent where official currency meant nothing. This was not a metaphor or an exaggeration. Cigarettes did not merely have value. They were money itself, functioning as completely and effectively as any currency that had ever existed. They possessed, quite accidentally, all the characteristics that economists since Aristotle have identified as essential for currency. They were portable. A man could carry significant wealth in his pockets. They were divisible. A single cigarette could be broken down for smaller transactions, though this reduced value slightly, just as damaged coins trade at a discount. They were durable enough for practical purposes, lasting weeks or months if kept dry. They were difficult to counterfeit. Everyone could recognize a genuine American cigarette. Most critically, they were universally desired. Smokers wanted them for consumption. Non-smokers wanted them because they knew smokers would accept them in trade. This universal acceptability is the cornerstone of any successful currency. The transformation was complete and systematic, not chaotic or haphazard. Prices were quoted in cigarettes with the same matter-of-fact precision they had once been quoted in marks or francs. A man might say his watch was worth 30 cigarettes the way he might have once said it was worth 30 marks. Debts were calculated in cigarettes. When one prisoner borrowed from another, the loan was denominated in cigarettes, sometimes with interest charged in cigarettes. Savings were accumulated in cigarettes, hoarded carefully against future need. A British soldier who found himself in possession of a carton of American cigarettes held something more valuable than a month's official pay. He could trade them for a Leica camera, a Luger pistol, a porcelain figurine that had survived the bombing. An American GI who understood the system could accumulate a small fortune simply by not smoking his ration and instead trading it to the desperate civilians who haunted the periphery of every military base. German women traded these cigarettes for bread, for milk, for coal. The cigarettes became the medium through which goods flowed from the occupation forces to the occupied population. The system extended beyond simple barter. Sophisticated exchange rates emerged between different brands of cigarettes, exactly as exchange rates exist between different national currencies. American cigarettes commanded premium prices. Lucky Strikes, Camels, and Chesterfields were the gold standard, the dollars and pounds of the cigarette economy. British cigarettes traded at a significant discount, perhaps 70% of the value of American brands. The quality difference was noticeable, and everyone in the market knew it. German cigarettes, when they could be found at all, were nearly worthless. Accepted only by the most desperate smokers or those who planned to trade them to such people. Even among American brands, subtle hierarchies existed. Certain brands developed reputations for quality or consistency. Rumors would circulate about which manufacturer had maintained its standards and which had diluted its tobacco. These reputations affected prices, just as the reputation of a central bank affects the value of the currency it issues. The genius of the system lay in its spontaneous emergence. No one designed it. No government mandated it. No economist proposed it. It arose naturally from the needs and choices of millions of individuals, all seeking to solve the same problem: how to engage in commerce when official money had failed. Adam Smith's invisible hand had created a currency out of tobacco and paper. In the prisoner of war camps, particularly those holding German prisoners under American or British administration, economists would later recognize something extraordinary. These camps had become perfect laboratories for monetary theory, controlled environments where the principles of economics could be observed in their purest form. The prisoners, cut off from the outside world, dependent on Red Cross parcels and military rations, had created complete functioning economies based entirely on cigarettes. R.A. Radford, a British economist who had been imprisoned in a German POW camp, documented the entire system with academic precision. His account, published after the war, would become a classic text in economics courses. He observed the emergence of prices, of markets, of entrepreneurs and middlemen who facilitated trades between parties. He watched as some prisoners, recognizing the opportunity, became cigarette bankers, lending cigarettes to others at interest, accepting the risk that the borrower might be transferred to another camp or might smoke the loan instead of repaying it. Radford noted that prices fluctuated with supply and demand in perfectly predictable ways. When Red Cross parcels arrived, prices for other goods, tea, coffee, chocolate, canned milk, would fall as supply increased and cigarettes became more abundant. In the days before new shipments were expected, prices would rise as cigarette supplies dwindled and competition for remaining goods intensified. The market was responding to fundamental economic forces with the same precision as any market on Wall Street or in the City of London. The cigarette economy revealed uncomfortable truths about human nature and economic necessity. It demonstrated that markets will emerge regardless of circumstances, that the drive to trade is fundamental to human society, that people will create order even in chaos. But it also showed the dark side of pure market forces operating without the civilizing influence of law, custom, or moral restraint. The cigarette economy was efficient, but it was also brutal, favoring the cunning over the honest, the strong over the weak, those with access to supply over those without. For the occupation authorities, the cigarette economy presented an intractable problem. Officially, they condemned it. Fraternization between soldiers and civilians was forbidden. Trading military supplies was illegal. The black market was a violation of military law. Yet enforcement was sporadic at best, hypocritical at worst. How could you prevent trade when people needed to trade to survive? How could you forbid soldiers from trading cigarettes when cigarettes were the only thing that worked as currency? The authorities found themselves trying to suppress an economic system that had emerged precisely because their own official systems had failed. The cigarette economy was never meant to be permanent. It was a bridge, a temporary adaptation to extraordinary circumstances. But in the spring and summer of 1945, in the fall and winter that followed, across a continent of ruins and refugees, those small white cylinders represented something more valuable than gold, more reliable than any government promise, more real than any official currency. They represented survival itself. The cigarette economy, hyperinflation, and black markets in 1945. Part 2. The mechanics of the system. The cigarette economy did not operate through chaos and improvisation, as one might expect from a system born in the ruins of civilization. Instead, it functioned with a sophistication that would have impressed the bankers and merchants of peacetime Europe. Within months of the war's end, a complex, multi-layered economic system had emerged, complete with price mechanisms, financial intermediaries, speculation, arbitrage, and all the other features of a mature market economy. At the foundation of this system lay the exchange rates between different brands of cigarettes. These rates were not arbitrary or random. They reflected real differences in quality, availability, and desirability, and they were known to everyone who participated in the market. An American Lucky Strike was not equivalent to a British Woodbine, any more than $1 was equivalent to a lira. The market recognized these differences and priced them accordingly. American cigarettes occupied the apex of the hierarchy. Lucky Strikes, Camels, and Chesterfields were the premium brands, the gold standard against which all other tobacco was measured. A single American cigarette could purchase a surprising amount. In the displaced persons camps in the summer of 1945, one American cigarette might buy a day's ration of bread, or a small can of meat, or a bar of soap. A full pack of 20 could purchase luxuries that seemed impossible in those desperate times: a bottle of wine, a warm blanket, a pair of boots. The premium on American cigarettes was not simply a matter of taste. Though American tobacco was generally considered smoother and less harsh than European varieties, it was also about trust and standardization. American cigarettes came from factories that had continued operating throughout the war, maintaining consistent quality control. Each cigarette was identical to the next. The packaging was intact, the contents fresh. This reliability was crucial in a world where everything else seemed uncertain and unreliable. British cigarettes traded at a substantial discount, typically valued at 60 to 70% of their American counterparts. A British cigarette might purchase what an American cigarette could buy, but it would take more of them. The discount was not simply snobbery. British cigarettes were objectively harsher, made with different tobacco blends, packaged less attractively. More importantly, British military supplies were less abundant in many areas, making their cigarettes scarcer and therefore less liquid as a currency. A seller might hesitate to accept British cigarettes if they feared difficulty trading them onward. German cigarettes, when they existed at all, occupied the bottom tier of the market. German tobacco production had collapsed along with everything else in the German economy. What cigarettes could be found were often poorly made, using inferior tobacco, sometimes adulterated with substitute materials. They might trade for 20 or 30% of American value, and only to smokers so desperate they would accept anything. Using German cigarettes as currency was risky. The next person might refuse them entirely. These exchange rates created opportunities for arbitrage. A clever trader who found himself with British cigarettes in an area where they were particularly undervalued could travel to another area where British cigarettes were more accepted, trade them at better rates, and return with a profit. The same principle applied to American brands. Areas near American military bases might see lower cigarette prices due to abundant supply, while areas distant from such bases might see higher prices. Traders emerged who specialized in moving cigarettes from areas of surplus to areas of scarcity, profiting from the price differential. The prisoner of war camps provided the clearest window into how the system functioned, precisely because they were closed environments where the variables could be more easily observed and understood. In these camps, economics operated in laboratory purity. Ira. Radford, the British economist imprisoned in a German camp, documented not just that trade occurred, but exactly how it occurred, what patterns emerged, what principles governed the market. Radford observed that every commodity had its cigarette price, and these prices were remarkably stable within short time periods, fluctuating predictably with changes in supply and demand. A tin of jam might cost 3 cigarettes. A chocolate bar might cost 2. A can of milk might cost 1. These prices were not fixed by decree or agreement. They emerged from thousands of individual transactions, from buyers and sellers finding mutually acceptable terms. When Red Cross parcels arrived at the camp, the immediate effect was deflation. The supply of cigarettes increased dramatically as every prisoner received their allocation. Simultaneously, the supply of other goods increased: chocolate, coffee, tea, canned foods. With more cigarettes chasing roughly the same, or even increased amounts of goods, cigarette prices for those goods fell. A tin of jam that had cost 3 cigarettes might now cost only 2. A chocolate bar might fall from 2 cigarettes to 1. This deflation was temporary. As time passed and the initial abundance from the Red Cross parcels was consumed or traded away, prices would gradually rise again. In the final days before new parcels were expected, when cigarette supplies had dwindled through consumption and trade, prices reached their peak. The same tin of jam that had cost 2 cigarettes when parcels first arrived might now cost 4 or even 5. The market was responding to scarcity with the same precision as markets had always responded throughout human history. The camps developed financial sophistication that seemed remarkable under the circumstances. Some prisoners became de facto bankers, lending cigarettes to others at interest. A prisoner who wanted to acquire something immediately but lacked sufficient cigarettes could borrow them, agreeing to repay the loan with interest when he received his next Red Cross parcel. The interest rate might be 20 or 30%, reflecting the real risks the lender faced. The borrower might be transferred to another camp, making repayment impossible. He might smoke the cigarettes instead of using them for their intended purpose. He might simply refuse to repay, gambling that the lender had no enforcement mechanism beyond social pressure. Yet the system worked, most of the time. Reputation mattered enormously in the closed society of the camp. A man known to default on debts found himself unable to borrow again, unable to engage in certain trades, socially ostracized. The invisible hand of the market was supplemented by the visible hand of social enforcement. Trust, once lost, was nearly impossible to regain. Middlemen emerged, prisoners who specialized in facilitating trades between others. If prisoner A had chocolate but wanted tea, and prisoner B had tea but wanted cigarettes, and prisoner C had cigarettes but wanted chocolate, a middleman could arrange a three-way trade, taking a small commission in cigarettes for his service. These middlemen provided genuine economic value. They reduced search costs, saving people the time and effort of finding their own trading partners. They assumed risk, sometimes taking possession of goods before finding a buyer. They provided liquidity to the market, making it easier for everyone to trade. Some prisoners became specialized traders, developing expertise in particular commodities. One might become known as the man to see for coffee, another for chocolate, another for razor blades. These specialists would accumulate inventory, buying when prices were low and selling when prices were high. They were speculators in the classic economic sense, and they performed the classic economic function of speculators, smoothing out price fluctuations by buying in times of surplus and selling in times of shortage. The system extended far beyond the prisoner of war camps into the broader economy of occupied Europe. In the cities, cigarettes opened doors that no amount of official currency could open. A lawyer might refuse payment in Reichsmarks, but gladly accept a carton of American cigarettes for drawing up documents. A doctor who could not be persuaded by money could be persuaded by tobacco. Government bureaucrats, whose stamps and signatures were essential for everything from travel permits to ration cards, were universally willing to expedite matters for the right price in cigarettes. The black market that flourished across Germany and Austria in 1945 and 1946 ran almost entirely on cigarettes. Penicillin, the miracle drug that could mean the difference between life and death from infection, traded for cigarettes. Gasoline, desperately needed for the few functioning vehicles, traded for cigarettes. False identity papers, essential for refugees and displaced persons trying to rebuild their lives or escape their pasts, traded for cigarettes. Information traded for cigarettes. Silence traded for cigarettes. Every human need, every human desire, could be satisfied if one had sufficient cigarettes. For soldiers of the occupation forces, particularly Americans, this created extraordinary opportunities. An American private received cigarettes as part of his rations. These cigarettes cost him nothing. They were simply issued to him. Yet these free cigarettes could be traded for items of significant value. A carton of cigarettes, representing perhaps a week's ration for a smoker, could purchase a Leica camera that would have cost a month's wages in peacetime America. Fine china, crystal, silverware, art, antiques, jewelry, all the accumulated wealth of European civilization was available to soldiers who had access to cigarettes and were willing to engage in technically illegal trading. The temptation was overwhelming, and many soldiers succumbed to it. Officers and enlisted men alike participated in the black market, despite regulations, despite the threat of court-martial, despite their own moral qualms. The economic forces at work were simply too powerful. When a German family offered a valuable painting for enough cigarettes to buy food for a month, when a young woman offered herself for a handful of cigarettes that might keep her parents from starving, the theoretical illegality of the transaction seemed abstract compared to the concrete human need. Non-smokers faced a unique psychological challenge. Every cigarette they received was, in economic terms, capital, but capital that could literally go up in smoke. The temptation to consume one's wealth was immediate and physical. Radford noted that non-smokers in the POW camps often struggled with this temptation. When hungry, when bored, when stressed, the urge to smoke a cigarette could be overwhelming, even for men who had never smoked before imprisonment. Each cigarette smoked was wealth destroyed, purchasing power reduced, future opportunities foreclosed. The truly disciplined non-smokers could accumulate substantial wealth by camp standards. A man who saved every cigarette from his Red Cross parcels for 6 months might have 100 or more cigarettes, a fortune sufficient to purchase significant luxuries or to trade for favors and services. Some non-smokers became the wealthiest men in their camps, their wealth built entirely on abstinence and patience. Smokers faced different calculations. They had to balance immediate pleasure against future need. How many cigarettes could one afford to smoke versus save? Some developed strict rationing systems for themselves, smoking a fixed number per day and saving the rest. Others lacked such discipline, smoking their wealth as quickly as they received it, then finding themselves poor and powerless when they needed to make a purchase. The cigarette economy revealed fundamental truths about human behavior and economic organization. It demonstrated that money is not created by governments, but emerges from human needs and choices. It showed that markets will form wherever people gather, regardless of laws or official policies. It proved that price mechanisms work even without central authority, that supply and demand are not theoretical concepts, but real forces that shape human behavior. And it showed that in conditions of extreme scarcity, economic efficiency can coexist with moral ambiguity, that markets can function smoothly even when their functioning depends on desperation. The cigarette economy, hyperinflation and black markets in 1945. Part 3. The human cost. Behind every transaction in the cigarette economy lay a human story, often desperate, sometimes degrading, occasionally redemptive. The elegant economic mechanisms that economists would later study and admire were built on a foundation of hunger, loss, and moral compromise. For every perfectly functioning price mechanism, there was a family selling their heirlooms for bread. For every efficient market clearing, there was a young woman making calculations about survival that no one should have to make. German women faced choices that haunted them for the rest of their lives. In the spring and summer of 1945, with millions of German men dead or imprisoned, with cities in ruins and the economy collapsed, women became the primary breadwinners and negotiators for their families. They were the ones who ventured into the black markets, who approached the occupation soldiers, who made the trades that kept their families alive. The family treasures accumulated over generations moved through their hands into the cigarette economy. A grandmother's porcelain tea set, manufactured in Meissen before the previous war, carefully preserved through decades, passed down as an heirloom. This might trade for 2 packs of cigarettes, enough to buy bread for a week. A gold wedding ring, symbol of a marriage that might have ended with a telegram from the Eastern Front, could bring 5 or 6 packs, perhaps more if the soldier buying it did not look too carefully at the desperate woman selling it. First edition books from family libraries, some dating back centuries, were traded for handfuls of cigarettes. Oil paintings that had hung in dining rooms for generations, violins that had provided music for family gatherings, silverware engraved with family crests, entire cultural inheritances dispersed through the cigarette economy. The objects themselves often had little practical value to the soldiers who acquired them. Many would be lost, damaged, or abandoned when the soldiers rotated home. But in that moment, they represented portable wealth, souvenirs, proof of having been there, of having participated in the great historical moment of occupation. For the German families, watching these possessions leave their homes was psychologically devastating. These were not merely objects, but connections to a lost world, to grandparents and great-grandparents, to a time before the war, before the catastrophe. Each sale was an acknowledgement that the old world was truly gone, that survival in the new world required sacrificing the past. Some women wept as they handed over family treasures. Others maintained rigid composure, refusing to show emotion to the soldiers, saving their grief for private moments. The word Fräulein took on new and bitter meanings in occupied Germany. Young women, some barely adults, others well into middle age, found themselves negotiating transactions that mixed commerce with intimacy. The exchange was usually implicit rather than explicit. A woman might accompany a soldier to bars or dances, might spend evenings in his company, might share his bed. In return, she received cigarettes, chocolate, coffee, stockings, cosmetics, sometimes cash and occupation scrip. These relationships existed in a gray zone between prostitution and dating, between survival strategy and genuine affection. Some women undoubtedly felt nothing but revulsion for what they were doing, viewing it as necessary degradation, no different from starvation, except in the specific mechanism of suffering. Others formed genuine emotional connections with the soldiers, found kindness or gentleness or humor in young men far from home. Many relationships were complex mixtures of economic necessity and authentic feeling, impossible to categorize simply as either exploitation or romance. The social judgment these women faced was severe and lasting. Ami-Liebchen, they were called, American sweethearts, and the term was not affectionate. In the immediate aftermath of the war, when survival required such arrangements, the judgment was somewhat muted by the general understanding that everyone was doing what they had to do. But as conditions improved, as the economy recovered, these women found themselves marked by their wartime choices. Some were ostracized by their communities, called collaborators, and worse. The men who had bought their favors with cigarettes returned to America and resumed their lives. The women lived with the consequences for decades. Children became integral participants in the cigarette economy, too young to understand the moral complexities, old enough to understand that cigarettes meant their families might eat. They congregated around military bases, near train stations, anywhere soldiers gathered. "Cigarette for Papa," they would cry, hands outstretched, eyes wide with calculated innocence. Papa might indeed exist, might be imprisoned in a camp somewhere, might be working in a rubble-clearing crew. Or Papa might be dead in Russia, or fled to Argentina, or simply a convenient fiction that experience had taught made soldiers more generous. The children learned quickly which soldiers were soft touches and which were harsh. They learned which military police patrols could be evaded and which were too vigilant. They learned the art of the trade, how to bargain, how to plead, how to deploy their youth and vulnerability as assets in the marketplace. Some became remarkably sophisticated dealers, acquiring cigarettes from multiple sources, understanding price differentials between locations, recognizing opportunities for arbitrage. The education these children received in the streets and markets was not the education their parents had envisioned for them. They were learning cynicism instead of idealism, calculation instead of trust, survival instead of morality. Many would carry these lessons into adulthood, their characters shaped by years spent as economic actors in a market that ran on desperation. Some would later describe their childhood participation in the black market with shame. Others would view it pragmatically, as simply doing what the situation required. A few would look back almost fondly on the freedom and agency they had possessed, the sense of contributing meaningfully to family survival. Elderly Germans suffered most acutely in the cigarette economy. They possessed a lifetime's accumulation of possessions, but often lacked the physical stamina or psychological flexibility to navigate the black market effectively. They were the ones most likely to be cheated in trades, most likely to accept unfair prices out of desperation or incomprehension. Soldiers who would not dream of cheating a young woman or a child sometimes had fewer compunctions about driving a hard bargain with an elderly couple selling their last valuables. The elderly also faced a cruel arithmetic of survival. Their caloric needs might be lower than those of young people, but their bodies were less resilient to malnutrition. They sickened more easily, recovered more slowly, died more quietly. In a world where cigarettes could buy extra food rations, medical care, or heat, those without cigarettes faced grim odds. The winter of 1945-1946 was particularly brutal, and mortality rates among elderly Germans without family support or black market access were catastrophic. In hospitals and clinics across occupied Germany, cigarettes determined the quality of care patients received. Officially, medical treatment was allocated according to need. In practice, cigarettes opened doors and expedited services. A patient who could offer cigarettes to nurses might receive clean bandages more frequently, might get pain medication more readily, might find their bed closer to a heat source. Doctors and nurses, themselves hungry and desperate, could not entirely resist the system. The medical professionals faced excruciating ethical dilemmas. They had taken oaths to treat all patients equally, to prioritize medical need above all other considerations. But they were also human beings struggling to survive. A nurse who accepted cigarettes in exchange for slightly better care was using those cigarettes to feed her own children. A doctor who expedited treatment for a patient who paid in cigarettes was trading his professional ethics for his family's survival. Most medical professionals tried to maintain their principles while making small compromises. Some compromised more extensively. A few refused to participate in the cigarette economy at all, treating all patients identically regardless of their ability to pay, and watched their own families suffer for their integrity. The occupation authorities understood perfectly well what was happening. They read reports from military police, from intelligence officers, from civil affairs units. They knew that their soldiers were trading military supplies on the black market. They knew that fraternization was occurring despite regulations forbidding it. They knew that the cigarette economy was undermining both military discipline and the official occupation policy. Yet enforcement remained sporadic and inconsistent. Officially, trading with Germans was prohibited. Fraternization was forbidden. Participation in the black market was punishable by court-martial. In practice, the regulations were honored more in the breach than the observance. Some officers enforced them strictly, conducting raids on black market locations, arresting soldiers caught trading. Other officers tacitly ignored violations, understanding that the black market served useful functions. It provided an outlet for soldier boredom, created goodwill with the local population, and redistributed military surplus to people who desperately needed it. The inconsistency bred cynicism among both soldiers and civilians. Soldiers learned which officers would look the other way and which would enforce regulations. They traded cautiously, always aware of the risk, but calculating that the rewards outweighed it. Civilians learned to navigate the arbitrary enforcement, developing networks of information about which areas were being monitored and which were safe. Some occupation officers participated in the black market themselves, directly or through intermediaries. A colonel who officially condemned black market trading might privately send his aide to acquire a valuable painting or a fine camera using military cigarettes. The hypocrisy was obvious to everyone involved, and it corroded both military discipline and respect for the occupation authority. Soldiers who saw their superiors profiting from the black market felt little compunction about engaging in smaller-scale trading themselves. The moral complexity of the cigarette economy defied simple categorization. Was a soldier who traded cigarettes for a camera engaging in theft from the military and exploitation of desperate civilians? Or was he engaging in mutually beneficial trade with people who valued cigarettes more than cameras? Was a German woman who traded family heirlooms for cigarettes preserving her family or betraying her cultural heritage? Were the children begging for cigarettes being exploited by a cruel system or demonstrating admirable resourcefulness and family loyalty? Different participants in the system would have answered these questions differently. Some soldiers viewed their trading as harmless, even beneficial. They were giving civilians access to goods they desperately needed in exchange for items the civilians no longer valued. Others felt profound guilt about their participation, sensing that they were taking advantage of people's desperation, even as they justified it to themselves. Some German civilians viewed the trades as degrading but necessary. Others approached them pragmatically, as simply the way commerce functioned in the current reality. The cigarette economy created winners and losers through mechanisms that had little to do with merit or morality. Those with access to military supplies became wealthy. Those without access starved. The clever and the unscrupulous prospered. The honest and the naive suffered. Physical attractiveness became economic capital for young women. Youth and agility became capital for children who could navigate the black market. Age and integrity became liabilities. The system was efficient in the narrow economic sense. It allocated scarce resources, matched buyers with sellers, cleared markets. But its efficiency came at an enormous human cost, paid in dignity, in cultural heritage, in moral compromise, in social bonds corroded by desperation. The cigarette economy kept millions alive who might otherwise have starved. It also left psychological scars that would never fully heal, memories of choices made under duress that would haunt participants for the rest of their lives. Years later, when survivors told their stories, the memories of the cigarette economy remained vivid and painful. They remembered the exact trades they had made: the violin for 2 cartons, the china set for 3 packs, the night spent with a soldier for enough cigarettes to buy a week's food. They remembered the faces of the soldiers, sometimes kind, sometimes contemptuous, always holding the power that came from access to cigarettes. They remembered the shame, the hunger, the calculations, the compromises. The cigarette economy had saved them, but it had also changed them in ways that could never be undone. The cigarette economy, hyperinflation, and black markets in 1945, Part 4, the end of an era. The cigarette economy could not last forever. It was always a temporary phenomenon, a bridge between the total collapse of one economic order and the establishment of another. Like all hyperinflations, like all periods of monetary chaos, it would eventually resolve itself, either through the restoration of legitimate currency or through complete societal breakdown. In Western Germany, the resolution came not through gradual evolution, but through deliberate action, a planned event that would become one of the most successful monetary reforms in history. The change began with rumors. In the spring of 1948, whispers circulated through the black markets of Frankfurt, Munich, Hamburg, and Berlin. The Americans were planning something. A new currency was coming. The exact details were unknown, closely guarded secrets among the occupation authorities. But the basic outline became increasingly clear. The Reichsmark would be abolished. A new mark would take its place. The transition would happen suddenly without warning, to prevent hoarding and speculation. The rumors created a strange paradox in the markets. On one hand, people knew the cigarette economy's days were numbered. If a new, stable currency were introduced, cigarettes would return to being merely cigarettes, valuable only for smoking or for trade with smokers. On the other hand, until the new currency actually appeared, cigarettes remained the most reliable store of value available. People found themselves in an economic limbo, unsure whether to accumulate cigarettes as insurance or to spend them quickly before they lost their monetary function. Some speculators gambled that the transition would be chaotic, that the new currency would fail or be rejected, that the cigarette economy would persist. They accumulated massive stockpiles of American cigarettes, betting that tobacco would remain more valuable than whatever paper the occupation authorities introduced. Others took the opposite bet, trading their cigarettes for durable goods, tools, machinery, raw materials that would hold value regardless of the currency regime. The announcement came on June 18, 1948. The Western Allies, American, British, and French, would introduce a new currency in their occupation zones. The Deutsche Mark would replace the Reichsmark. The currency reform would be comprehensive and radical. Every German citizen would receive 40 Deutsche Marks in cash, savings accounts, debts, wages, prices. Everything would be converted to the new currency at drastically reduced rates. The old Reichsmark would cease to be legal tender almost immediately. The details of the reform were breathtaking in their scope and audacity. Savings were converted at a rate of 10 Reichsmarks to 1 Deutsche Mark for the first 600 Reichsmarks, then 20 to 1 for amounts above that. Debts were similarly reduced. Wages and prices were to be set in the new currency. The effect was to wipe out accumulated monetary wealth while preserving real assets, factories, buildings, land, equipment, and providing everyone with enough cash to begin participating in the economy. The announcement created immediate panic in the cigarette markets. Within hours, cigarette prices for goods began fluctuating wildly. Some sellers, desperate to convert their cigarettes into something that would hold value, dumped their stocks at drastically reduced prices. Others, hoping to ride out the uncertainty, held firm or even raised prices. The market that had functioned so smoothly for 3 years was suddenly convulsing. Then came June 20th, 1948, the day the Deutsche Mark officially entered circulation. Germans queued at banks and distribution points to receive their 40 marks. The bills were crisp and new, printed in the United States and shipped to Germany in secret. They featured images of allegorical figures rather than political leaders, a deliberate choice to make the currency neutral and acceptable to all Germans regardless of their political past or regional identity. What happened next astonished even the architects of the reform. Almost overnight, the shop windows that had been empty for 3 years filled with goods. Merchandise that had been hoarded, hidden, saved for the black market suddenly appeared in legal commerce. Shopkeepers who had kept their inventory concealed, unwilling to sell for worthless Reichsmarks or to enter the dangerous world of cigarette trading, now displayed their goods openly and set prices in Deutsche Marks. The transformation was not instantaneous everywhere, nor was it complete, but its speed defied expectations. Within days, the black market that had dominated German economic life began to contract. Within weeks, it had diminished to a fraction of its former size. Within months, it existed only at the margins, dealing in goods that remained restricted or rationed, or in services that skirted legal boundaries. The cigarette economy did not disappear in a single day. Cigarettes remained valuable, particularly in the immediate aftermath of the currency reform when Deutsche Marks were still scarce and the new system was untested. But their role changed fundamentally. They were no longer money itself, but merely a commodity, valuable to smokers and to those who traded with smokers, but no longer the universal medium of exchange. The transition created winners and losers. Those who had hoarded cigarettes found themselves holding depreciating assets. The value of cigarettes did not collapse completely. They remained desirable and somewhat scarce, but they no longer commanded the premium they had enjoyed as currency. A carton of American cigarettes that might have purchased a week's worth of food in May 1948 might purchase only a day's worth by August. Those who had converted their cigarettes into durable goods, or who had maintained their skills and productive capacity rather than focusing purely on trading, benefited from the transition. Craftsmen, mechanics, professionals, people who could offer services in the new economy, found themselves in demand. The Deutsche Mark economy valued productivity in ways the cigarette economy had not. The currency reform was accompanied by other changes that reinforced its effects. Ludwig Erhard, the director of economics for the British and American occupation zones, used the occasion to abolish many of the price controls and rationing restrictions that had governed the German economy since the Nazi era. This deregulation, combined with the currency reform, unleashed productive capacity that had been suppressed for years. Factories that had been operating at minimal capacity, their output diverted to the black market, began producing for the legitimate economy. Farmers who had been holding back crops, unwilling to sell for worthless Reichsmarks, brought their produce to market. The combination of stable currency and market prices created incentives for production that had been absent for years. The Marshall Plan, announced in 1947 but beginning to deliver substantial aid in 1948, provided critical support for the recovery. American aid flowed into Germany in the form of food, raw materials, machinery, and capital goods. This aid supplemented the currency reform, ensuring that the new Deutsche Marks could actually purchase goods, that the new economy had the resources it needed to begin growing. The black market did not vanish entirely. Some goods remained rationed or restricted, creating continuing opportunities for illegal trade. Coffee, tobacco, gasoline, and certain manufactured goods still commanded black market premiums. But the scale was incomparably smaller than it had been. The black market became a supplementary system rather than the dominant one, an outlet for marginal transactions rather than the main channel of commerce. For many Germans, the currency reform marked a psychological turning point, as profound as the end of the war itself. The war had brought military defeat and physical destruction, but it had left the basic mechanisms of daily life somewhat intact. The hyperinflation and the cigarette economy had destroyed those mechanisms, making normal life impossible. The currency reform restored normalcy, or at least the possibility of normalcy. People could work for wages that held value. They could save for the future. They could plan beyond immediate survival. The soldiers of the occupation forces experienced the transition differently. For 3 years, they had enjoyed extraordinary purchasing power, able to acquire valuable goods for handfuls of cigarettes that cost them nothing. The currency reform did not eliminate their advantages. They still had access to military supplies, still received pay in hard currency, still benefited from their position. But it reduced those advantages substantially. The days when a carton of cigarettes could purchase a camera or a piece of fine china ended. Trade continued, but on more balanced terms. Some soldiers resented the change. They had grown accustomed to their privileged position in the cigarette economy, had come to see it as a natural and permanent feature of occupation life. The currency reform felt like a loss of status, a reduction in their effective wealth. Others welcomed it, feeling uncomfortable with the moral ambiguity of the cigarette economy, relieved to see Germany beginning genuine recovery rather than remaining dependent on black market commerce. For historians and economists, the cigarette economy and its end became a subject of enduring fascination. Here was a natural experiment in monetary economics, conducted on a massive scale with millions of participants. The spontaneous emergence of cigarette currency demonstrated fundamental principles about the nature of money. The success of the currency reform demonstrated that well-designed monetary policy could reverse even severe hyperinflation. R.A. Radford's account of the POW camp economy became a standard text in economics courses, used to illustrate principles of supply and demand, price formation, and monetary theory. Students learned how markets emerge naturally from human interaction, how prices convey information, how financial intermediaries develop even in the most unlikely circumstances. The cigarette economy became a teaching tool, its human costs abstracted into theoretical lessons about economic behavior. But for those who had lived through it, the cigarette economy remained something more visceral and less theoretical. It was the time when their grandmother's china left the family forever. It was the winter when survival meant trading away everything of value. It was the summer when a carton of American cigarettes represented wealth beyond imagining. It was the moral compromises made under pressure of hunger, the dignity sacrificed for survival, the old world traded away for cigarettes and bread. The memories proved surprisingly durable. Decades later, Germans who had lived through the cigarette economy would still remember specific transactions with painful clarity. They remembered what they had traded and what they had received, remembered the faces of soldiers who had held their family treasures, remembered the calculations they had made about what could be sacrificed and what had to be preserved. The cigarette economy had lasted only 3 years, but it had marked them permanently. Some of the soldiers who had participated in the cigarette economy later expressed regret. They recognized, in retrospect, that they had taken advantage of desperate people, that the trades that had seemed fair at the time had actually been exploitative. Others defended their actions, arguing that the trades had been voluntary, that they had given people access to goods they desperately needed, that they had helped rather than harmed. Still others simply fell silent on the subject, unwilling to examine too closely what they had done in their youth. The cigarette economy ended, but it never quite disappeared from memory or from economic consciousness. It remained as evidence of certain truths about human nature and social organization. It demonstrated that markets will emerge wherever people gather, that money is a human creation rather than a government decree, that economic laws operate regardless of circumstances or intentions. It showed that in conditions of extreme scarcity, efficiency and brutality can coexist, that functioning markets can rest on foundations of desperation. The ruins of 1945 were eventually cleared and rebuilt. The displaced persons found homes or made new ones. The generation that had lived through the cigarette economy aged, retired, and began to pass away. But the lessons remained, preserved in economics textbooks, in historical accounts, in family stories passed down through generations. The cigarette economy had been an aberration, a temporary deviation from normal economic life. Yet it had revealed permanent truths about what happens when normal economic life breaks down, about what people will do to survive, about what emerges when everything else has failed. In the end, the cigarette economy stands as a testament to human adaptability and human cost. It showed that people can create order from chaos, that economic systems will emerge even in ruins, that the drive to trade and exchange is fundamental to human society. But it also showed the price of that adaptability, measured in heirlooms sold, in dignity compromised, in moral choices made under duress. The small white cylinders that once held the power of life and death returned to being merely cigarettes. But the memory of what they had been, and what people had done for them, would last as long as anyone remained who had lived through those desperate years.